This video is going to look at a really cool event that you've never heard of. They say that hindsight's 20/20, and if this is the case, then we've surely lost our glasses when looking back at the American Civil War, sometimes failing to see the true nail-biter that it was, and a bloody one at that. The death toll over the 4-year conflict was a devastating 625,000, roughly 2% of the total population. That's more than both World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, all of them combined. 1 in 4 soldiers never even returned home, and 1 in 13 of those who did so missing an arm or a leg. And like I alluded to, it's easy for us to shorten things for the purposes of explaining them in the history classroom. Why did the North win the war? To put it shortly, they had more soldiers and more industry, more cash, more manpower. As historian Richard Current put it, as usual, God was on the side of the heaviest battalions. All of that is true, but also ignores some close calls that may have changed things. It ignores, for example, the event that we're going to be talking about today. One event that almost altered American history. This affair, as it is today so innocently titled, could have given the South a winning advantage, or, at the very least, the means by which to prolong the war and the bloodshed longer than it did. This moment that nearly changed the war was the product of Northern anxiousness. President Lincoln was under demoralizing pressure. In the summer of 1861, the Union lost the first major battle of the Civil War in embarrassing fashion. Sent to quell the rebellion early in Richmond, Virginia, Union General McDowell was nervous about engaging his 32,000 inexperienced troops in battle, but beleaguered from political pressures to show strength against the rebels, President Lincoln assured him, "You are green. It is true, but they are also green. You are all green alike." The 18,000 men with whom McDowell eventually engaged were routed from battle by the Confederates, with the Union Army humiliated and running aimlessly towards Washington, D.C., a reality soaked through. Blood would likely drench many fields for longer than anyone had originally anticipated. Off the battlefield, the South was far from a burgeoning new state. They faced a dilemma of their own, and the clock was ticking. You may be surprised to know that this problem wasn't centered around the strength of their unity, nor the capacity of their leaders or citizens to engage wholeheartedly for the cause of the South. The biggest Confederate problem was cotton. In April 1861, President Lincoln established a naval blockade of over 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline, including 12 major Confederate ports. This gradually reduced Southern cotton exports by 95% and limited their ability to transport supplies effectively to the front lines. Without cotton cash from Europe, the South would surely lose the war. European powers weren't too pleased about the blockade either. Though advocating neutrality, countries like Great Britain relied on Southern cotton for their textile mills. Though opposed to the institution of slavery, their de facto endorsement of this northern blockade directly hurt their economy. And this reality set the stage for conflict. The South needed cash, and fast. And if they could convince the French and the British to recognize them diplomatically, then they could potentially end the blockade. It wouldn't even require Britain and France to ally officially with the South, but simply to recognize them diplomatically. This would make the northern blockade of the South an illegal maritime act, and this might force European powers to intervene and break that blockade. Hey guys, just wanted to clear one little thing up, okay? Break the blockade means to simply go through the blockade. The South wanted the European powers to recognize them diplomatically, go through the blockade and just ignore the North basically until a peace was mediated. But as you'll see, things get really muddled and crazy in just a second. Enjoy the rest of the story. And with this in mind, President Jefferson Davis sent 2 diplomatic envoys, James Mason and John Slidell. It would be their mission to run the blockade, sail to Britain and France, and achieve diplomatic recognition. If successful, Mason and Slidell could change everything. Now, the 2 diplomats sailed from Charleston, South Carolina, and upon missing their rendezvous with the CSS Nashville, rerouted to Havana, Cuba, where they awaited transport on the British mail steamer RMS Trent. On November 7, 1861, the Trent was intercepted upon its departure from Havana by the USS San Jacinto. Captain Charles Wilkes, acting on a rumor that Mason and Slidell were aboard, and importantly, without direct orders from the US government, ordered the Southern diplomats confiscated from the Trent as contraband. Mason and Slidell were arrested and transported to Fort Warren in Boston as prisoners of the Union. Now, Captain Wilkes, with this action, single-handedly put the Northern cause in danger. However, the Union was still in shock over the loss at Bull Run, and this capture of Mason and Slidell gave the press and the populace a reason to celebrate. But this jubilation was indeed ephemeral. When word reached Europe on November 27th, the boarding of the Trent and imprisonment of Mason and Slidell was perceived by the British public as a justification for war with the northern states. The British began planning for war, sending troops to Canada, who at the end of December numbered at nearly 18,000. More potently, they outlined a sacking of the northern blockade in the south and a simultaneous new blockade on Union ports to be executed with the aid of the French. This left President Lincoln with a critical decision to make. Captain Wilkes, in interrupting Mason and Slidell's mission, may have inadvertently accomplished it for them. The Union could crumble under the weight of a multi-pronged war. Here's what Lincoln said: "One war at a time." And so, thereafter, the North publicly disavowed the actions of Captain Wilkes and eventually released both Mason and Slidell. Conflict between the Union and Europe was de-escalated. Thereby, history, as we know it from our history classrooms, was made.